Hello, I'm environmental students. Well, today we're going to be continuing climate change, specifically solutions, which are going to be called adaptations. An adaptation is a adjustment in the human or natural system that is going to respond to an actual already seen or an expected climatic stimulus or the effects, which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. Whoa, what is that? So that means that we are going to make some sort of change as humans based on what we think or are seeing happening in our climate. So this is assuming climate change is happening. What are we going to do about it? So flood defenses are an example of an adaptive strategy. These are, for instance, we could talk about the case study of Hurricane Sandy, which has very much been thought to be related to climate change because we have more extreme weather events when we have climate change. And so what happened was many houses in the New Jersey and New York area went totally underwater if they were at all close to the coast. And so now in those areas, after 2012, those areas have the mandate to build up their houses, otherwise they're going to have fines, and in order to get house insurance they have to build up their houses. So this is called raising a house or putting a house on stilts. Sometimes they put that garage underneath the house. They are given tax breaks if they do this sometimes. We could also try to avoid flooding problems if we try to manage the water better or catch water. But in general, it's encouraged at this point, if we are going to build new things, maybe don't even build in places that are more commonly flooded. We've now seen examples of what we think might happen when sea levels do rise. So in any of those areas where we see the sea level rising, they want to make these adaptive changes ahead of time before there's another hurricane, and that way if there is a hurricane, all the house doesn't go underwater because there was terrible things that happened when those floods occurred. Another adaptive strategy is based on the water actually maybe not existing enough. So if there's little water, we could irrigate our crops better and more carefully, sustainable irrigation. We could have desalination plants, which is taking salt water, ocean water, and removing the salt, although that takes energy and is kind of an expensive process. So an LADC couldn't reliably do that, but we could in an MEDC, and there are desalination plants throughout the US in certain places. We could capture rainwater or runoff through things like rain barrels. We could seed clouds, which is taking the water out of a cloud, but who owns a cloud? And if I take water from a cloud in one place, does that mean it's not going to rain in another place? I could be careful in places like California. They're planting drought resistant plants. This is called xeriscaping. And so instead of planting a regular green lawn, they don't even plant a lawn. They plant things that don't even need watering. Or we could plant genetically modified crops, which would be expensive, that don't need water either. Both things are more likely to happen in an MEDC where they have more money and more technology. We could also make sure we're being very careful about things that are going to affect humans very directly, such as the fact that we might need to vaccinate better and have doctors ready, because if we have warmer climates that are wetter, we're going to have more insect-borne diseases such as malaria, dengue fever, and even currently now we hear a lot about Zika. So we're going to be kind of worried about those things. If we can vaccinate in advance, we're going to try to do that so it's less likely diseases will transmit quickly. We also want to be careful about managing our supplies. So if we think that there's very likely going to be air pollution and smog, we want to be careful about that. If we think that food is at risk in an area, we want to be very wary of that and prepare ahead of time. In general, if there's an evacuation plan, we want to make sure people know about that. So in general, we want to increase communication and education for people in areas so that they're more likely to survive in the event of an emergency. So those are all really good examples of adaptive strategies, and we're going to evaluate those more in class. But now that we've learned about mitigation and adaptation to climate change, what we want to start thinking about is everyone equally able to do these things? We're going to start evaluating them. So adaptive capacity is the term that means not everyone has the ability to be successful doing this. Remember, all these things were very technological. They also cost money, so MEDCs are going to be a lot more like likely to support these ideas and changes than an LADC, which is very tough. So in general, international efforts have existed to try to get the whole world on board, and we have this timeline. Now, I highly recommend you jot down this timeline in your own words. I understand that it's a lot. I don't expect you to know specific dates, but I do want you to know general order and big ideas. So in general, we started hearing about climate change more and more, and officially in 1988 when we heard the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, being formed, and then by 1990 they put out their first report, and this report said that climate change is happening, guys, and it's supported by scientific evidence. But still people weren't so sure, so a couple years later this other group by the UN formed, and they had many governments sign that, guess what, those greenhouse gas levels are too high, let's bring them back down to before 1990 levels, which is below 350 parts per million before the year 2000. Now we know now that of course that didn't happen, and so they had a conference, they put out more reports, they started seeing that humans are the major causes of climate change. They end up having some more international conferences, specifically one called the Kyoto Protocol, which many governments signed to put CO2 emissions down. But you know what? The U.S. wasn't a really good role model. The U.S. refused to sign. This is pretty crazy because then the IPCC puts out another report that humans are the cause of climate change, and that really it's likely that by 2050 the world will be a lot hotter by approximately 5.8 degrees Celsius. Oh boy. So, by 2004, Kyoto Protocol is still not effective. Specifically, even by 2005, the U.S. hasn't ratified the treaty, although many other industrial MEDCs have signed it. Places like Japan and more have signed this thing, but the U.S. has refused. And by 2007, even more IPCC reports have come out, and now we see that there's impacts even within a couple decades that we're noticing more hurricanes, we're seeing major problems, but the world goes through a crazy economic crisis. We see the global housing market bubble blow up in everyone's faces, so everyone's really worried about their own politics, their own civil unrest, and their own economies, very much so, but then they're saying we can't handle talking about greenhouse gas emissions right now. By 2009, China has overtaken the U.S. by being the largest greenhouse gas emitter, but the U.S. isn't much behind. By 2013, we've now hit over 400 parts per million CO2. We haven't been there since the age of the dinosaurs or earlier. And by 2014, we have another IPCC report, and by 2015, we have the Paris Climate Agreement. And now we're at current time, which when this is recorded, it's 2017, and 2016 has just recently passed. So the Paris Climate Agreement is still underway. So what ended up happening, the nations have gotten together, they signed some agreements, they're trying to reduce more emissions. This is a follow-up on Kyoto, since Kyoto wasn't very successful. The nice thing about the Paris Agreement is that everyone's trying to decide, okay, we need to not allow warming to go above 2 degrees Celsius because we were worried it's going to be above 5. Because 2 degrees, there's going to be major changes, and we saw all those climate adaptations aren't going to be possible for everyone. The idea is that there's a huge amount of money that people are going to have to put forth. People are setting their own objectives country by country. But that's nice because MEDCs aren't going to be able to do the same as LADCs. They're picking their own ways of doing it. And so what we'll see in a moment is that the mitigation and adaptation are going to need to be happening at multiple levels. And so that's our next slide. But we'll talk more about Paris Climate Agreement in class. So really what we want to see is that climate change pollution management, both mitigation and adaptation, they're going to happen on international, national, and local levels. And we need to be able to talk about all of them. I just picked a couple to put into these different nesting dolls, but there's pros and cons to all of these levels. And we can evaluate them all. So I would pause here and jot this down. Last but not least, I want to leave you thinking about a couple things that we'll talk about in class. Who's going to make these changes, mitigation or adaptation, especially setting these limits, right? And when should we do them? Remember, we talked about in a previous notes that Not everyone agrees to be precautionary because some people are skeptical about climate data. And who should make these changes and who should pay for them? Should they be at the local level? Should they be at the national level? And so forth. Not everyone agrees on those things. And if they are at the international level, like the Paris Climate Agreement, which we'll learn more about in class, should people be assuming that MEDCs and LEDCs should be making the same sort of binding agreements? And did they both contribute to the climate issues equally? And can we even track that? And can they both equally make those changes? Remember, there's that adaptive capacity. Does an LEDC have the same money or technology to be able to make changes, or are they just trying to survive to be able to eat and have clean water? So we'll talk more about this in class, and it is a tough issue, and there's no clear answers, but we definitely want to start thinking about what possibilities are. So I want to leave you with a very solution-oriented mind, and we'll be thinking about those solutions in class. Great job, guys.